So welcome to the Binary Analysis Research Workshop, the BAR workshop. So as you probably know already, the BAR workshop focuses on binary analysis research. And so over the years, we had a whole range of really cool topics. And it keeps going. It's still a lot of relevant research to do in that space. So we really had like a lot of, all the way from like the more formal aspects, binary proofs, static analysis, abstract interpretation, dynamic analysis, anything that has to do with binaries, we're happy to hear about it. So please do not hesitate to submit your cool research next year. So this year we had a total of 16 submissions. We only had room to accept 10. The history of this workshop has, we've had different number of submissions over the years and accepted papers. We kind of like settled on 10 last year. So 10 is pretty much the maximum amount of papers we're able to accept. So we're really not trying to be selective here, right? So 10 out of 16, we're not trying to have a low acceptance rate. That's not the goal of BAR. The goal of BAR is we want everybody to be in the same room and talk about their cool binary analysis research. Ideally, our goal really, if we could accept all the papers, we would gladly do it so that we can all chat about our cool ideas. Unfortunately, we are space and time constrained, so we do have to, to make some sort of selection. Now, there might be a change next year about this. As you might know, NDSS will probably not happen in San Diego next year. NDSS, if you're not familiar, has always been in San Diego since, when was NDSS created? I forget, probably like the early 90s or something like that. So it's been a while. Next year it will be somewhere else, but it's kind of a surprise destination. We don't know where it will be yet. But we're talking about having a bit more of a, varied presentation format. So we will have sessions like this, but possibly we might actually have poster sessions as well, so that everybody can really, present their research one way or the other. That would allow us to accept more papers. So it's still hypothetical. It depends on the logistics of the venue and so on. But this is what we've been discussing with Sebastian. So we'll see what happens with that. We'd like to thank our amazing program committee for all the hard work in reviewing papers and so on. So this year, just like last year, we kept a very similar format, 10 papers split in 2 sessions. The first session is more about fundamental binary analysis research. So the idea is, any paper that works on advancing binary analysis research, binary analysis techniques. This is what we're talking about this morning. So we will have 5 papers in that space. This afternoon, we'll talk more about applying binary analysis. So more application space, what can we do with those cool tools and techniques? How can we apply them to solve problems of in different application spaces? We also have the honor of having 2 keynotes this year. The first keynote this morning, in fact, will start in a few minutes, is from Perri Adams. If you're familiar with the DARPA program AIXCC, Perri was behind this huge program, huge success, applying AI to binary analysis. So Perri was at DARPA. She's these days she's a fellow at Dartmouth, actually, at the ISTS, which is the ISTS is an institute attached to our CS department, basically. This afternoon, we will also have another keynote from Marion Marszalek. And so Marion will tell us about, the past and some outlook on the future of binary analysis. So Marion has been working on malware reverse engineering for many years. She used to be at Intel, AWS. These days, she runs her own company called Hack and Cheese. If you attend hacker conferences like Recon or DistrictCon or Reverse in a couple of weeks, actually in 1 week, is it next week? next week in Orlando. Marion is doing reverse engineering trainings at those conferences. So if you're around, recommend checking it out. So this is our schedule. So this morning, more fundamental binary analysis. This afternoon, more applied binary analysis, and we'll have a keynote, preceding each session. That's pretty much all I got for this. So you're probably aware we have our schedule online on the NDSS website. And yeah, thanks for coming, and enjoy the workshop.
Okay, it's 9 a.m. Let's get started. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for having me. It is an honor to address BAR. I've always been a very big fan of this conference. I have to say, I think it's a little nepotistic that you asked me to do this, given that I'm currently at Dartmouth ISTS. No, I'm kidding. So my name is Perri Adams. I got my start in this space playing CTF. And I was at DARPA as both a program manager and special assistant to the director. While I was at DARPA, I ran and started a number of programs, including the AI Cyber Challenge. And I recently left DARPA and doing company. I'm a fellow at Dartmouth ISTS, among some other things. But what I've really enjoyed over the past 6 months is having the time to really sit with all of the research that's coming out, especially the AI-driven research in this space, and really get to read it, play around with the models, test out the research myself. And so that's why I was really excited to address BAR, because over the years, this has been one of my favorite conferences to see the research that's coming out. It's always very applicable to the work that I'm doing, both as a researcher and when I was at DARPA. And what I wanted to talk about today was the thought process that goes into developing DARPA research programs, and really what I learned from my experience there, what I learned from designing the challenge, and how the specific design of the challenge created the results that we will talk about, and how this is actually incredibly applicable to the work that you all are currently doing. And so first, I want to lead with an example. I've used this in other talks. I think it's a really great example of the thought process that we were having around the time that we were developing the challenge. And so this was a little into when the AI Cyber Challenge started, but this is the kind of research that we were seeing at the time, which was math Olympiad problems. A few years ago, and I think still now, everyone was using AI to solve math Olympiad problems. This was the test set. This was what folks were really interested in. And for me, and I think for other folks in this space that think about using AI for binary analysis, for program analysis, et cetera, these are really interesting. This is a really interesting space of research to follow, because some of the reasoning, the hard challenges, are very, very similar. Sean Heelan has talked about this as well. He's someone that's really specialized in automating exploit generation. The way that mathematical problems are structured lends itself, obviously, to the area of program analysis, reverse engineering, et cetera. And what's so interesting about math Olympiad problems is just how well-formed and well-structured they are, right? If you're doing any kind of binary analysis, you know that the hard part of what you're doing is actually getting to that well-formed and well-structured problem that you can then feed into a tool. And so it was really interesting to look at how folks were jumping off of the work that was done to use AI to solve math Olympiad problems and really extrapolating off of it. So you'd see things like AI achieves silver medal standard solving international math Olympiad problems. That's a headline from Google, and I think that's a fair headline. I agree that that's accurate. The New York Times reported move over mathematicians, here comes alpha proof. And now I know some mathematicians, and I have to say they did not take too well to that headline. They found it to be a little offensive. I'm not a mathematician, so I didn't really care. I thought it was funny. But all things the same, when you're at DARPA, when you're overseeing a lot of research, you hear about this stuff all the time. New York Times publishes that. You're getting dragged into the director's office and being told, are we replacing the mathematicians? Do I need to be worried about X, Y, Z thing? And you're having to explain, okay, no, here's sort of the difference. Yes, this is really impressive research, but here's its limitations. And so I want to talk about some of the problems and why both Math Olympiad problems are interesting for program analysis, but why they are also not. And so these problems, as you'll be familiar, they're well-formed statements, right? These are problems that you'd be familiar from any discrete mathematics class that you took early on in your computer science education, right? You have well-formed statements, they follow a standard format, they're easily legible, and they come with examples. And they're also scoped and vetted by actual individuals, right, on the committee. And so if we look at problem number 1, determine all real numbers alpha such that for every positive integer n, the integer, that equation is a multiple of n, right? And we're not going to solve it today here in class, but I thought this was just an interesting problem for us to look at, and to look at the various ways in which the students in 2024 solved this problem. And what I found the most interesting is that you have a number of solutions. So there were 4 total solutions that were created in the answer key. Students found other additional ways to solve this problem as well. And as I was reading through the student-done solutions, and as I was thinking about how Alpha Proof was able to solve this problem, and the New York Times was claiming that it was better than mathematicians, I was thinking, well, I can solve this problem too. I'm better than AI. I don't want to be told that AI is smarter than me. And so I sat down and I, brought back my discrete mathematics education and did my own solution of this problem. I also sent it to my partner who has a PhD in mathematics, and he is not a computer scientist. He actually focused on topology. And so he said, oh, well, I can solve this as well. And so just to embarrass him, I always like to show his solution next to mine. So I did a very basic solution. It's very similar to solution 2, but it's just induction, etc. He turned it into a partial geometric series and reduced it to a theorem that he was familiar with, and then solved it from there, which is obviously a ridiculous way to try to solve this. When it is actually a pretty simple number theory problem. But what I liked about this is it offered an opportunity to look at the ways that different folks solved problems, to think about how there's different ways to solve these problems, to think about how the problems break out into all of these various sub-problems, and that you're bringing your own experiences, expertise, your own training data to the problem. He was trained on partial geometric series and that kind of thing. And so that's the approach he took. Now, what was then interesting, oh no, we're going to see if I can load this video. What was then interesting was looking at how Alpha Proof solved this problem. And so it's worth looking at how Alpha Proof actually works. So we've talked about how humans solve this problem. Alpha Proof uses the lean proof engine. That's what it's built on top of and this is important, for its problems that do not require geometric reasoning. And it uses this to check intermediate and final statements. So it's using an LLM to generate, and it's trained this model by generating a lot of statements and basically using the lean proof engine as a fitness function, as something that can evaluate the accuracy of the statements. And so with Lean, what you have is a nice abstraction. So you have a language, essentially an IR, that you can form these Math Olympiad problems in, and you have a reward function, right? That proof engine. And so that's what the final alpha proof solution looked like. And it was actually different in some ways from all of the other answers, although of course there are similarities between them. Like I talked about, alpha proof has a formal approach to reasoning. And what I would call, and this is kind of a bit of a DARPA term, a neurosymbolic approach to problem solving, where you have both an LLM and you have a more stochastic approach to the problem, but then you also have an abstraction layer that translates into something that's much more logical, that you can, a symbolic layer that you can use for deduction. And what was interesting is that they had to create their own. So they were able to use the Lean proof engine for the proofs that did not require geometry, but for geometric problems, they then had to build their own engine called alpha geometry to solve those problems. They had to essentially create their own symbolic layer over the problem and use that for reasoning. Which brings us to something that I think everyone at BAR is going to be very familiar with at this point, which is the need to create these symbolic abstractions, right? Whether those are IRs, whether those are whether those are leveraging pre-existing CFG formats, creating your own, creating symbolic execution machines. I know that when I was at DARPA, the thing I would constantly ask my performers is, do we really need another IR? Do we really need another symbolic reasoning engine? Can't you just use the one that exists? Everyone wants to create their own, and that's one of the hard problems that folks in binary analysis have been thinking about for years and years and years. And this is something that folks in AI have thought about and are currently thinking about as well. And even though these are different types of problems, the similarities, I think, are quite striking. So we're going to come back to that point. But I was thinking about this. I was thinking about the narrow symbolic nature of the problem. I was thinking about how difficult it can be to create appropriate evaluations of autonomous tools when I was creating the AI Cyber Challenge. So what's interesting about the Math Olympiad problems and their choice for AI tooling is that when the folks at OpenAI, at Claude, at any of these large labs are using them to evaluate and train and create different models. At Google, they chose Math Olympiad with the understanding that it was lossy, that it wasn't going to create actual mathematicians, but that it was going to get them some of the way there, part of the way there. It was going to create a gamified, a structured evaluation. And that's essentially what you do when you're building a DARPA program. So for instance, when I was building the AI Cyber Challenge, that's exactly what we were thinking about, is how do we take the extremely complex space of doing program analysis. In this case, it was for vulnerability discovery and remediation. How do we take this very, very complex space and we reduce it to something that is both still real world, but is reduced and gamified sufficiently so that we can put $30 million on the line and evaluate folks in a fair and transparent 2-year period to drive forward development and innovation in this space. And that's a really, really hard problem to do, to solve, and that comes with a lot of trade-offs and a lot of hard decisions. And I want to talk a little bit about what those look like. I'm sorry for some of the technical issues. So really quick, for those of you who aren't familiar, this was a 2-year-long competition. We kicked off in August of 2023. We held semifinals in August of 2024. There were about 50 teams 50 to 100 teams that were competing in the semifinal competition. The top 7 teams won $2 million each and advanced to the finals, which were held this past August. I'm sorry, I have the actual numbers here. 42 teams showed up to compete. There were 5 different challenge projects that we'll talk about in a sec, but this was essentially what semifinals looked like, and we're going to come back to that. And so let's talk about what it meant to design an effective competition. And you'll be surprised that a lot of this has actually nothing to do with the technical stuff. As I think many of the folks in this room, have dedicated their careers or a huge, significant portion of their life to doing in the weeds technical work. And in fact, when I first went to DARPA, what I was told is that you are going to get rusty. You are going to lose your grip on technical reality because you're going to be doing PowerPoint slides and program management and all of this stuff, and you're going to have to keep it fresh in your free time. But are you prepared to move from a very, very technical role to one that's not technical at all? And that was a hard decision that I had to make. It was very rewarding, but what it meant is that I was spending a lot of my time not getting to think about the in-the-weeds technical things, but getting to think about, okay, how do I incentivize the other technical researchers out there to come together and devote 2 years of their life to this challenge? How do I figure out what funding authority I can use in the US government to be able to move prize money and cut checks fast enough to do this in this time period? Things that no technical researcher actually wants to spend their time thinking about. But that was the most important part of this competition. One of the most important parts of this competition is making it worth folks' time and being able to move that money quickly. Because AI was progressing so fast, because folks in this space can make a lot of money doing other things, we had to make sure that we were putting enough prize money on the line. And that's where this $30 million prize pot came from. And this was something I really had to fight for and pull salaries and say, listen, this is what folks are making in industry, et cetera. This is what even college labs are taking in. And people are just going to do other things if we don't incentivize this properly. So the second thing I had to do, and keep in mind, this was several years ago. This was before you had the kind of API access and ease of use and engagement with the labs, because we were first ideating this in late 22, early 23, was access to the state-of-the-art technology. So OpenAI, Anthropic, Google DeepMind, and Microsoft were our collaborators on this effort. And the goal was, rather than us to sit in DARPA in DC and at various universities doing work completely separate from the innovation happening in California, that we really needed to combine forces, because the folks at the labs in California, despite just how good they were, they don't have the expertise that's in this room. They don't understand binary analysis in the same way. They don't understand program analysis in the same way. It's just frankly not their background. They're extremely good at AI, but they aren't familiar with this space. But they're being told by the US government, by their shareholders, by folks in industry that cybersecurity is one of the most important applications of the work that they're doing, and they're very interested in this space. The flip of that is, I've overseen a lot of DARPA programs. I've seen some phenomenal AI research. I'd also seen work that frankly was falling behind the state of the art that we were seeing coming from industry, falling far, far behind the state of the art that we were seeing in industry. And part of that was the lack of connective tissue between industry and academia and research. And so that was a huge aspect of this. And keep in mind, this was the first effort that OpenAI ever did with the Department, it was the Department of Defense at the time. And this took a lot of work to get these folks to show up and to do work. And part of the reason that they ultimately signed up for it is because of the opportunity to work with folks like the ones in this room and to learn from that expertise. And this all feeds into the third aspect of this, is moving quickly. I am almost certain that no challenge has ever been stood up faster than I stood up AICC in the history of DARPA. This was an extremely quick effort. Some eggs were broken, some tears were shed, not by me, but by others. Yes, by some of the teams, I'm sure. But part of the need to move quickly was because of how quickly the models were evolving, because of how quickly AI was evolving. And frankly, if we did not do this in a 2-year time period, what we produced was going to be useless. But finally, and this is the thing I'm going to really get into today, and this is where my technical background and the fact that I was still running DEFCON CTF and clinging desperately to my technical bona fides mattered. Because game structure is really what mattered in this competition. Without a solid game structure that would actually drive innovation, nothing interesting would have come. Nothing interesting would have come from this effort, which is why I put it in very large font. So game design. So let's talk a little bit about what the game design was, and let's talk about the trade-offs. So the first thing that I was insistent upon was real software. We had to do a challenge that was based on real software. DARPA had run a challenge similar to this 10 years previously. This was a really formative, groundbreaking challenge that had been done on synthetic software that moved the needle. But if we were going to do synthetic software again, we were just going to be in a loop, repeating ourselves. We weren't going to be moving forward, innovating. And so we had to make sure that we were doing this on real software, and not just toy software, not just bin utils, but on software projects that were representative of the security challenges that the real world is experiencing today. And for that, going back to the importance of collaborators, we brought in the Linux Foundation and the Open Source Security Foundation. But the problem you have with this is that you have real world vulnerabilities in that software. And so this turns into a huge headache because you need to have a challenge set where you have an answer key so you can quickly evaluate teams. Keep in mind, we have 42 teams. We don't have time to manually review every single bug that they're finding, et cetera, et cetera. You need to have a answer key that says this is a real vulnerability, this is not a real vulnerability. But the problem with using real world software is there's going to be real world vulnerabilities in it that you don't have the answer key for, which is a great problem to have because you'll be finding real world vulnerabilities, but a hard problem to have because it creates design and competition around it really, really difficult. And so that was the second problem that we had to solve. We had to reduce the number of languages we would work on to C and Java, and create challenge projects around that. And and part of what we did, and this was really helpful with our collaboration with Google, was leverage ASAN and Jazzer and work that the OSS Fuzz team had been doing at Google to evaluate and aid their fuzzers and build on top of that. The benefit of this is used in a lot of real-world test and build systems already. And this is something that is well maintained, and we don't have to reinvent. Going back to that question of do you really have to create your own special custom unique IR for this project, right? We did not want to be creating our own vulnerability assessment tooling. And so we then had to figure out, okay, how are we testing for vulnerabilities? How are we designing these challenges? How do we keep it both real world but also small enough and gamified enough, right? So we don't want Math Olympiad problems, which are really overly gamified, but we also can't do like here's the Linux kernel, find all of the vulnerabilities in it. And so we had to create ideas of proof of vulnerability, and then we had to design challenges around real-world things like patches, like deltas between in code, and like the outputs of a static analysis tool. That's what that serif is, as well as getting real source code and taking that in. And so we had 3 different kinds of challenges, essentially, which was evaluating commits, evaluating source code, and evaluating the outputs of static analysis tools. And teams would submit a proof of vulnerability, something that triggered a SAN or Jazz or something like that, assessment of that static analysis output, whether it was a false positive or a true positive, and a patch, a fix for that code. And so finally, one of the hardest aspects of it is the scoring system, right? Your evaluation. How are you going to evaluate all of these things? How are you going to weight this? And this is something that was just a huge, huge headache, because you want to create something fair. This was during a period of time where everyone was very concerned about, I'm going to say a bad word here, AI safety. I think we're saying something different now, but everyone was very concerned about AI safety and making sure that we were doing this safely and securely. And me saying, guys, honestly, the tools aren't even that good at finding vulnerabilities right now. That's not my biggest concern, wasn't cutting it. And so we had to make sure that everyone was on board with just how safe and security focused this challenge was. And so that meant making sure that patching was prioritized more than just fixing the vulnerability. Because otherwise, you're going to have teams that are going to just submit vulnerabilities and just spray all the vulnerabilities they can find and never submit patches. And then you have a challenge that was intended to create a patch system, an automatic patch system, and doesn't. And so we had to create a very complex scoring system to enable that. And as you can see, we have all of these various acronyms, and we have a vulnerability discovery score, and a program repair score, and a serif assessment score, and a bundle score, and these are all weighted differently and added up, and then we released the weights at some point, and it was a real pain to come up with this, to get everyone on board with it, to evaluate it, to tweak it. And part of the reason we did weighted, we took all of these different areas and we weighted them and then released the weights to teams, is so we could incentivize teams to design a system that they could toggle for these different areas and for the different weights that were placed on the areas, but also so that we can make sure that we were appropriately weighting program repair over things like vulnerability discovery and serif assessment. Now, when we were designing this, what we kept thinking about the entire time was, well, how is someone going to mess with us? How is someone going to try to game the system? And the thing that I kept reinforcing to the team over and over and over again is that it is not a bad thing that competitors are going to try to solve the problem that we have in front of us, because the naive, idealistic version of this is, oh, all the competitors, they're just going to try to solve program repair and vulnerability discovery, and everyone's in it for the kumbaya. And it's like, sure, but everyone's actually in it for the millions of dollars on the line, and they don't care about solving whatever kumbaya problem DARPA has. They want the money, and they're going to try to solve whatever problem we put in front of them. They are a reinforcement learning algorithm, and they are going to be designed to whatever the fitness function is. And so if they have a reward function that rewards them for finding more vulnerabilities than patching, it doesn't matter how much in their heart of hearts they want to fix programs. They're going to say, I want millions of dollars. I am going to try to find vulnerabilities. we also had some infrastructure problems as well. Something I think is familiar with everyone in here who's written a paper and they have a phenomenal academic idea that they think is just the creme de la creme. And then most of that idea is trying to set up the infrastructure and writing extremely boring code for that. And so resource constraints were a huge issue for us because we had to ensure that folks couldn't just throw huge amounts of compute on the problem, right? If you might have competitors that come from Fortune 500 companies that can't afford to throw huge amounts of compute on the problem, maybe more than the prize money that they might win, but they're doing it for the credibility, for the plaudits of winning a DARPA competition. So how do you do that? Now, in the past DARPA challenge that had been run, CGC, what had happened was all of the systems were air-gapped. But wait, we can't do that here because you do have to phone out to the various LLMs. Like OpenAI isn't going to give us just a air-gapped copy of the model in a ballroom in Las Vegas so we can run this competition, nor would I have them do that. That's a complete waste of time. There are other ways to creatively solve this challenge. So we had to be careful about how folks were phoning out, and we also had to constrain the resources and constrain the infrastructure and give folks a budget. But what this provided for was actually an extremely important part of the challenge design, and again goes back to creating something that's real world, which is this has to be cost effective. Like DARPA is not creating technology that can only be used by the top 0.1% of companies. DARPA is trying to create technology that can be used by everyone. And that means we have to create technology that can run within a reasonable budget. And so this provided us with an opportunity to limit infrastructure spending by actual USD dollar amounts. Which was helpful for us, but it also provided us a really interesting way to assess how different teams solved the problems. And as you can see, you have some teams that spent a huge amount of money on compute resources, and some teams that spent very little money on compute resources and actually spent more money on LLM spending. But the most important aspect of it, and the thing that would make everything else completely useless, is the final requirement, is the open source requirement. And this is something that I got into a lot of fights about. This is where the other people crying part comes in, because there was a lot of woe about the open source requirement, because everyone saw this as Perri trying to prevent them from creating their next big unicorn company, because magically overnight, automatic vulnerability discovery was suddenly going to become a lucrative business opportunity. And I am very supportive of innovation, of VCs and Ps investing in this space, and of folks trying to commercialize their technology. But I'm also aware that this is a taxpayer-funded program, and also that the work that comes out of DARPA programs is so often, and it's even in this case, but especially in this case, gamified and not immediately real-world applicable. What was going to happen is you'd have all of these tools that were great and were designed to work on the gamified AICC challenges that were as real life as we could make them, but still had their limitations and weren't immediately applicable to actual real-world software development challenges. But also because of just how important open science and open innovation had been to the development of AI tooling, and because of my experience at DARPA with just how important open academic approaches were to innovation, I felt it was imperative that folks release the work that they had done to allow the community to engage with it, to adapt it, to build on top of it after the challenge. But this again goes back to the money that was on the line, the prize money. every single team that spent 2 years, that spent an additional year working on this, all 7 of the semifinalists, they won $2 million in cash prize money to spend that additional year developing their systems. And the top 3 teams won $4 million, $3 million, 1.5, and these are real prize amounts, much larger than most competitions that you're going to find in the U.S. government. And that was, again, intentional, right? If I'm going to make everyone open source their work, then I want to make it worth their while. I understand that the value that you all provide. And so now that we've gone through sort of what went into the design of this challenge and the thoughts, the thought process that was driving it, let's talk a little bit about some of the work that the teams did and how the design of the challenge really motivated it. Really motivated the work. So I want to talk about the winning team's design. This is Atlantis. So this was a team out of Georgia Tech in collaboration with Samsung and a couple other folks that built the winning system. And if you go back to our scores, you can see just how well they did. They had significantly higher scores than the second and the third team. And so what you see here is a huge amount of engineering work. And this was the first aspect that I want to talk about, is that if you look at how Atlantis approached Team Atlanta approached the problem and how their system approached the problem, is they thought of this in many ways, first and foremost, as a performance and resource management problem. We are given X amount of resources. How do we optimize within those constraints, right? How do I fill that knapsack most effectively? And they have a 150-page paper written on their tool, and at the front of it, they talk about not AI, not program analysis, but engineering infrastructure and resource management, how they were thinking about resource management. And so what they did was they supported multiple challenge projects concurrently, and they were as fail-safe as possible, and they fully utilized the LLM and Azure budget. And they kept meaningful logs. Part of what came out of this was that Team Atlanta tried throwing things. They basically threw a bunch of things at the wall. You can see how they have so many different modules here. I'm a little overwhelmed, I'll be honest. They're doing a lot. And they just threw a bunch of modules at the wall. They constantly evaluated how those modules were doing throughout the game, and they gave them more resources or fewer resources depending on how well they were doing. And then they open sourced the entire thing. And so what that means is we have all of these different approaches. We can play with all the different approaches, and we can see which ones were doing well and which ones were not doing well through the game. It really spurred a very broad approach to innovation. It was also very interesting to look at how they did their resource strategy, and how they split resources between the different tools. And what's so important about this is that on so many DARPA programs, resources are not taken seriously enough, and optimization and just boring engineering challenges are not taken seriously enough to produce useful real-world results. Like, it's great that someone produce a phenomenal symbolic analysis approach that works on a toy binary that's was 1,000 lines of source code, but in the real world, it's completely useless. Right? And we all know about state explosion. We all understand the resource constraints of these problems, but it can be really easy to publish a paper that looks really good because it was done on toy problems, and then the real world completely falls flat. And so part of the design of the challenge was exactly this, was forcing people to think very strategically about how they were using finite resources, and to think very strategically about evaluating program analysis approaches within a constrained environment. And what was interesting that came out of this was which tools performed best. And what they found was that their multi-lang, their tool that was for multiple different kinds of languages and wasn't tailored to C or Java, was actually performing best on these problems. Now, going back to the open source requirement, that is a really interesting data point, and that's something that doesn't tell you that, oh, in all cases, a generic approach is better than tailoring for a language, but it does mean that that may be true in many cases, and we should dig in further. So going back to game design, before we dig into Team Atlanta's results a little bit more, is again that proof of vulnerability that I was talking about. How you actually submit to the DARPA team evaluating this, the vulnerabilities your system is finding. It's not enough to just say, in many cases, it was not just enough to say here at line number. You also had to show that you had a triggering input, an input that would trigger that vulnerability. This is something that you often don't see in many vulnerability discovery tools, is the ability to actually reach the vulnerability. It's great that there's a vulnerability in this piece of dead code that no attacker could ever reach, but I should not be prioritizing that over the reachable vulnerability that is remotely accessible and reachable. And so having things like proof of vulnerability was, again, very important to creating a realistic tool. And so we'll come back to that, but let's talk a lot about the ways that all of the AICC teams, including Team Atlanta, approached the problem. And it was to combine, I'm so sorry, I've misspelled analysis here. Oh, and the internet is so bad, I'm not even going to try and fix it. Please pretend there's neither. We saw a lot of, similar to what we were seeing with the Math Olympiad problem approaches, you saw a lot of some neurosymbolic approaches, combining traditional symbolic abstractions with AI. And so you had, this challenge was not just throwing AI at vulnerabilities and seeing what would happen. It was some of that, but it was also leveraging all of the existing tools of the trade and adapting them to AI. So traditional fuzzers, symbolic execution engines, static analysis engines. As you can see here, in Atlantis, we're going to dive into the part of Atlantis that is the multi-lang component, the one that's doing vulnerability discovery across different languages, isn't specialized. And as you can see here, a lot of it, the non-yellow parts of this, are traditional program analysis tooling. So yes, it's an AI-driven program, but if you read the rules, there was no requirement to use AI. I thought it would be redundant and ridiculous to put a requirement to use AI in there, because in practice, if the thesis of the challenge is that AI is going to be a driving force behind it, but if you require folks to use AI, then you aren't appropriately evaluating whether AI actually makes a difference. If you aren't using the existing state-of-the-art effectively, you are not sufficiently testing whether the new approaches are better than the old approaches, and whether combining them actually produces something better. We talked about this, that the generic approach accounted for a significant number of the vulnerabilities found, verified vulnerabilities found during the competition. But what they also found was that their fuzzer, the given fuzzer, accounted for 50%. So yes, they were using LLMs to find vulnerabilities, but they were also just using a fuzzer to find them as well. Now, going back to the importance of transparency, what does that actually mean? If you look here, you'll see that they have their fuzzer. That feeds into the executor, back into here, and that's a loop. And so you could have had something that the last output was from the given fuzzer, but originally had some LLM agentic approaches to specialize it on different amounts of code. So I think Atlanta even said more work was needed to identify how much of this was truly AI driven. But the fact of the matter is, going back to how we as DARPA designed this challenge, not mandating AI, ensuring that traditional tools were used, was such an important aspect of that. So if we dig into Atlanta's multi-lane component and we look at how they used LLMs, what becomes very apparent is just how agentic their approach is. Because you can see that they have all of these different components that all specialize in one or another, in one approach or another. And if you consider now in 2026, it is given that you would take an agentic approach to the problem. But keep in mind that this challenge was being created in 2022 when OpenAI had just released a functional, usable GPT. And where, yes, people were talking about agentic approaches, but this really wasn't the hot topic at RSA and all of these ridiculous conferences today. What I find most interesting about the agentic approach that they took, though, was just how extensible and adaptable it can be for a broad range of program analysis problems. In the same way that the Google Gemini folks, DeepMind folks, took Math Olympiad problems and they broke it into, we're going to use a proof engine, we're going to use Lean for the non-geometry problems, and you know what, geometry is different and requires specialization, so we're going to use a different system that we build specifically for that, and we're also going to have a different agent that's ingesting the problems and parsing them out, et cetera, right? You're seeing the same need to specialize. This is also similar to how folks work in practice. I actually have one of my colleagues here, Andrew Roof, who I'll embarrass for a second. Andrew and I are doing a company together. We have some other people at the company. And the beautiful thing about the work that we're currently doing is that we all specialize in different things. Andrew and I overlap in our specialties, but he has a huge background in program analysis and vulnerability discovery on a huge number of targets, as well as the work he did in his PhD that I don't have. And I have all of this experience with AI and the application of autonomy to this space that he doesn't have. And as we're working together in our company and doing work, we often separate out the problems into our various specialties. It's also the case that some people like Andrew and they don't like me, and some people like me and they don't like Andrew. And so we separate out who we talk to too. No, I'm kidding. I don't think anyone doesn't like Andrew. Anyways, the point is that the same approach you take in your CTF teams, the same approach that you take broadly is going to be, when you take a difficult problem and you say, I'm going to put my RE guy on that, I'm going to put my binary analysis guy on this, I'm going to put the crypt person on that problem, I need to combine these two people. That's what you're doing with this system. You're breaking it out and you are creating agentic approaches. I think for a lot of people in this room, I'm telling you what you already know. But what was very interesting was seeing how they did that breakout. So they had a call graph parser agent. So an agent, and I really do love how they described these agents, which is why I pulled it out and put it here. The most organized person you know, the one who never gets lost, always knows exactly where everything is, can give perfect directions anywhere. And so this is an agent that specializes in the locations of various aspects of the source code being analyzed within the call graph, right? You have an agent that is a specialist in differentiating between false positives and real bug detection, right? So a tool that is focused on differentiating between what requires deeper analysis, what requires more resources on this resource-constrained system, and what doesn't require more resources, which is exactly what companies have to do in the real world. They don't have engineers that can dive into every single bug that gets output by a static analysis tool. You have a make call graph agent, right? Something that actually makes that call graph, that actually creates that symbolic abstraction for other agents to use. In some ways, you're actually using AI to generate the symbolic abstraction that you're then having a different AI agent use, right? You have a challenge project understanding agent, so someone that sees the reachability, essentially, the attack surface and the ingress and egress points. And then you have an agent that leverages the remarkable ability of AI to generate code to generate not just generate attack payloads, but to create programs that generate attack payloads. So if you've ever played CTF, this is the guy on the CTF team that knows everything about pwn tools, probably has his own version of pwn tools that he's written in some ridiculous language. And he's the one that when you know how to solve the problem and you know how to write the exploit, but you're on a constrained amount of time, you go to him and you're like, dude, I get it. I know how to hit this thing. Can you please write this? I do hope there are some CTF players in the room, because otherwise that just fell flat. And what I liked about this was that the MLLA here is generating attack strategies, right? It is thinking in some ways like a security researcher. I think one of the reasons that Team Atlanta did have significant success is they had folks with real world experience doing security research on their team. So I'm going to breeze through the rest of it, the rest of this. But in addition to the agentic approach, right, you saw a lot of prompt engineering come out of the challenge. Again, this is something that folks can use broadly across a range of problems, including, of course, binary analysis and things like that. The approaches used in AICC are directly transferable because you can go into all of the open source tooling and pull out the prompt strategies, adapt them for the program analysis you're trying to do in binary analysis, and modify them appropriately. And finally, we have the custom tooling that came out of AICC. And what we found, and so we're going to actually move on to a different team's, the third place team's outputs. What we found is that folks that took an LLM first approach, including Team Atlanta, which had a huge section that was very LLM first, they created custom tools for those LLMs to use. So because things like grep and cat worked with, in some cases, but were lossy and were ineffective for use by the agents, people had to create tools that were designed specifically for agents in AICC. And then finally, you had the failing safely aspect of the challenge. And because there are some folks from the Shellfish team in here, I'd be remiss if I didn't dive into that just a little bit. I was very impressed with the postmortems that came out of the challenge and the thought that folks put into how they could take autonomous tools and make them fail safe, make them able to get back up, stand back up. We've all seen the videos of the robots falling down, how you could make those robots stand back up and actually get back in the game and keep finding vulnerabilities, keep fixing vulnerabilities, keep doing program analysis. And that has been and that was a really important aspect too of the open source design of the challenge, which was to encourage teams to talk very openly about where they had success, but where they also had things that they would have done differently. Even the winning team, they almost had a near fatal bug that would have taken them from the top place to one of the non-prize winning places on the team. And so I want to talk a little bit about how all of this relates to the stuff that I've seen at BAR. And so before I was coming here, I had the opportunity to read through a lot of the papers that were submitted. They are fantastic. My hat is off to the program committee. I'm really interested, obviously, based on my background, in a lot of the AI-driven papers that are being presented today, right? And the way that neural decompilation, which is a significant topic, obviously, requires a lot of these custom training data, similar to, for instance, creating challenge projects, designing appropriate challenge projects that we're doing on AICC. In many ways, the work that you all are doing is designing those same challenge projects in the form of training data that takes source, binary, decompiled pairs, or tuples, right? You also have to have, and I saw this in a number of the papers that I read, different approaches to creating better reward functions that would better adapt existing LLMs, better evaluate them. But then I also saw work that was doing better CFG layouts, custom IRs, better graphical representations for use in LLMs, creating custom structures for LLMs. What I saw was a lot of manual binary analysis for training AI and manual structure and abstraction development, whereas in the past, it might have been for use by other researchers or use by other manually developed tools, but rather now it's designing structures and abstractions for AI ingestion and manual tool development, just like on AICC, creating custom cat and grep. Manual tool development, not for human use, but for AI use, and manual evaluation development to test the AI tools or performers. These are all things that we were doing when creating the DARPA challenge, right? Creating our own challenge projects and having folks manually find vulnerabilities in them to create a training set. Creating, using ASAN, et cetera, and then adapting ASAN, Jazzer, all of these other things so that AI tools could use it. And then, of course, creating our own evaluation system, which brings me to say, congratulations on your promotion, because you are all DARPA PMs now. Instead of just doing the research, what you're doing is creating programs, DARPA programs, your own mini DARPA programs to better train and equip AI to do this research. And there's a lot that can be learned about how, about the thought process that goes into structuring programs that produced useful results. And I'm very excited to see everyone suffer in the way that I suffered for the last 4 years now. So congratulations. And with that, I think I'm at time.
Hi there, great talk. Thank you. I'm Will Gibbs from Arizona State University. My question is, recently there are labs doing great research like Anthropic, who just found 500 zero days using just their AI solutions. But how does that stack up, or how can you compare what was done in the AI cyber challenge to what's being found now, right? Is it obsolete now that the AIs can find all of these zero days?
I'd actually argue the opposite. Anthropic brought in multiple folks that worked on the challenge to work on their internal tools. Anthropic, because they were so involved in the challenge, they were able to rapidly adapt the research that was done in the challenge and incorporate it into their internal tools. So I actually think that a lot of what we're seeing out of Anthropic is a success of the challenge. It opened, I was working with them very early on, and they had a phenomenal team, but frankly, I think the challenge exposed them to the program analysis community and expertise that they hadn't previously had the same kind of touch points for.
Thank you.
Hi, Zion from Arizona State as well. Awesome talk. Really cool to know the internal process of making a program of this scale. I wanted to ask if you had any advice for those who are curious about what it takes to make a program like this. So a lot of the talk was on that, how to make a successful program. What do you think is kind of the best advice for that in this space, especially in this age of AI, where it feels like maybe programs exploring more formal things are dwindling? Any advice on that?
Yeah, I think what I talked about at the beginning of the talk is that folks who do technical work often really want to stay doing that technical work. It's a very comfortable space, but if you don't expose yourself to the real world and to just the boring real world issues that come from the challenges that you're trying to solve, you aren't going to be able to create programs that ultimately will have sufficient funding and interest from the folks that matter. So one of the problems that I ran into at DARPA is, frankly, that people don't, commercially, customers don't care about security in the same way that they care about performance. They don't care if their browser is secure as much as they care that their browser is fast, right? And so you have to create tools that are cost efficient for companies to want to use. That was another reason for doing the open source aspect of it, is because it made it much easier to adopt and much more low cost to adopt, right? It makes sense for the US taxpayer to do it because there's a national security risk at having insecure software. So thinking about not how we wish the world could be, right? Where everyone believes it makes a lot of sense to pour money into formal methods, but how the world actually is. And working within those constraints to change those constraints, right? If you believe it should be different, people should care more about security, figure out how to get people to care more about your area of expertise.
So kind of like a theme I'm getting here is adoption as like a core thing to look at the beginning.
Yeah, I'm not saying that thinking commercially or thinking like a VC or a startup is going to always be the right approach. I do not think that research should suddenly shift to that, because research for research's sake has quite a lot of value. But it can also be siloed and redundant and ultimately not useful. It's you have to, at DARPA, a lot of what I thought about was how to do that, how to have that balance, make sure that we are not replicating what the Valley, what VCs are already going to do, but that we have real world applications.
Awesome, thank you.
Nice talk. How much time do we have, Christoph?
We have 2 more minutes. We have a half-hour break, so I think technically.
Oh, okay. So half an hour plus a few minutes. I have 2 questions for you.
Oh, good.
I have 2 questions for you. One is, the work that you did to make this happen is phenomenal. I know, from all the way back to from the CGC days, right? It took very long for CGC to ramp up and, for everything to happen, and that was a multi-year effort. So my question for you is that obviously, you spent a lot of effort and a lot of time to make things happen, but the time was very constrained. What would you have done differently assuming you had not like 1 year or a few months to set up everything, but let's say a few years to set up everything? That's my first question. And my second question is, so AI is progressing extremely quickly nowadays, right? Including LLMs, but like also including many other things, and a lot of that is really because of the awesome research that people are doing. But we also see that AI is kind of eradicating a lot of research because AI is so good. So what do you think? You're no longer at DARPA, so I hope this is a fair question for your comment. What do you think DARPA's role will change with the fact that AI is getting rid of some research? Thank you.
I think the first question is a really great question. The cop-out answer, but the one that I feel is very true, is simply put more time into the game infrastructure and the challenge design. It would have been great if there was a broader number of languages to which this was applicable for, and the challenge was designed to create more generic approaches rather than specializing on languages, because that would have, when we're seeing so many folks write Golang, Rust, and have logic vulnerabilities, that would have been a really interesting thing to assess. That would have required, though, thinking, like making sure that you were designing a challenge that wasn't too broad, such that people spread themselves so thin that none of the research was interesting. We just didn't have the time to do that cost-benefit analysis. The rush, I think, also squeezed just a lot of different areas of the challenge design, of the evaluation, of the as well as just the communication with teams and how much stuff could have got to the teams earlier. It would have been phenomenal had folks had more time to study and work with the semifinal structure. And so had we had more time, I think that I think that communication with the teams and a broader, maybe more modern than Java and C approach would have been the two things right at the top of my list to change. I'm sure I think of more. The second question is, I don't think that AI is. I disagree with the premise that AI is killing. Well, I agree that it is making obsolete certain aspects of research, but what I'd actually say is it's just rapidly advancing them, and folks have to keep up with that. And so it's taking areas of research and it's completely changing how you should think about the research, right? Instead of asking what tools should I use for someone to manually develop, right? You're thinking about, how do I develop a tool that that AI can use to better analyze a binary, right? Some of the papers here about, okay, great, well, when LLMs are adapted to do decompilation, they don't have a great understanding of the graphical structure, right? How do I train or create graphical structures that are better used for AI, right? And so I think that's a very forward-looking approach, where you're saying, listen, AI is going to be extremely important in decompilation, just because of how stochastic it is. How do I enable that? And instead of fighting against that, which I think you have some legacy decompilation engines that are still very good, but I think are struggling to effectively embrace AI, right? I think that the beauty of DARPA is the fact that you are fired on your first day. So when you show up, you are given a badge, and that badge has an expiration date. So like milk, you expire within 2 to 4 years as a PM. And so DARPA is all about bringing in expertise, outside expertise, paying them competitively, right, to incentivize folks to leave whatever job they have and to come into DARPA, and giving them a huge amount of power and authority and funding money to create their own research programs. And the counterbalance to that is you can't stay there and ossify. You have to leave. at some point. And so I think the way that DARPA does this going forward is to bring in new folks that are on the forefront of AI research, who understand where this is going to be, I don't want to say killing areas of research, but rapidly changing those areas of research, and make sure those are the ones structuring the next generation of DARPA programs. But it also means helping, I think one thing, the DARPA performer base, right? One of the challenges is that you have a performer base that does largely DARPA programs, and they also have to evolve and adapt. And so make sure that you are structuring those programs to help folks with more legacy expertise bring that expertise to bear, but innovate. That was part of why that partnership with those Silicon Valley companies was so important to the challenge. And I think DARPA right now, I'm no longer there, so I'm not speaking for them, but I know that current DARPA leadership is very invested, as well as the Department of War's Research and Engineering Department is very invested in public-private partnership, in commercial partnerships, in working with the Valley. And so I think that's going to be a really important aspect of this next generation of technology.